Hello. In this video, I'll elaborate on some more of Foucault's ideas about the way the author function operates within various forms of discourse. In the third section of the essay, Foucault notes that books and texts that have authors attached to them become objects of appropriation, by which he means something like a commodity or property. He further says, without offering any evidence, I should point out, that this commodification of texts was a secondary effect of the need to establish the limits of what could be printed. Basically, the laws governing what can be said, the institutions of censorship, led to laws about who owns what is said. Foucault then claims something completely speculative. It was at the moment when a system of ownership and strict copyright rules were established that the transgressive properties always intrinsic to the act of writing became the forceful imperative of literature. I want to pause over this for a moment because I think it's a really weird claim, not least because it seems to suggest that literature for Foucault is distinguished by the impulse to transgress. Now, since it seems to me that plenty of books uphold rather than violate social norms, I'm not sure what to make of this. It looks to me like an example of residual romanticism, of the kind that Foucault earlier seemed to reject. But perhaps we can talk about this in class. The bottom line point, however, is that the idea of authorship is inextricably caught up with legal and commercial notions. An author is not merely a creator, but a property owner. Indeed, the designation of author as property owner can actually displace the notion of author as creator altogether. We can see how this works in practice if we consider the function of a name like Walt Disney, which floats like that of an author over dozens of properties, even though the historical Disney may have had no creative input whatsoever in the work. With this notion of authors as owner and text as property, I must revise my earlier claim that Batman has no single author. In fact, all legally sanctioned uses of the Batman image, no matter how different in appearance, tone, or style, do have a single author in this one sense of author as owner, although that author is not a single person, but a corporate entity, Time Warner. Nevertheless, at different times in Batman's history, some versions of the character and property have been more authorized than others. For example, in the mid-1960s, at the height of the success of the TV show, DC and Time Warner had no problem with this version of Batman. But in 1989, in the run-up to the release of Tim Burton's first Batman movie, Time Warner legally barred Adam West from making public appearances in his homemade Batman costume, something that he had done all through the 1970s, as when he made this short public service announcement about road safety with London school children. Time Warner did not want the camp associations of the TV show uppermost in the minds of critics and audiences for the new film. In other words, there are different authorized versions of Batman at different times, and sometimes they come into conflict. And this raises the question of how some versions of Batman become more authorized than others. Foucault can help us to think about this question with one of the most interesting sections of his essay, on pages 1402 to 1404 in the version that I have supplied, when he attempts to describe what he calls the transhistorical constants in the rules that govern the construction of the author. In literary criticism, Foucault says, the traditional methods for defining an author, or rather for determining the configuration of the author from existing texts, derive in large part from those used in the Christian tradition to authenticate or to reject the particular texts in its possession. According to Foucault, St. Jerome, the patron saint of librarians, by the way, offers 4 criteria to establish a canon. Inferior texts are eliminated. Thus, the idea of the author is defined as a standard of quality. So are texts containing ideas said to conflict with established doctrine. Thus, the idea of the author functions to establish a field of conceptual or theoretical coherence. As are those written in a different style, containing words and phrases not ordinarily found in other works. Thus, the idea of the author is defined as a guarantee of stylistic uniformity. And finally, as are those referring to events or historical figures subsequent to the death of the presumed author. Thus, the author is located as a historical figure. Although there has obviously never been an attempt to establish a single author for Batman, over the course of Batman's history, it's possible to see ways in which these criteria have indeed been invoked by DC and within fan culture to authorize or to legitimate some versions of the character over others. And it's also possible to see particular Batman authors making a bid for their own authority in ways that evoke these criteria. Consider, for example, the conflict between Bat creators and Bat fans over the value of what we've been calling the camp version of Batman from our last module and the more serious version espoused by Frank Miller and others. It's noticeable that the Batman TV show, along with the goofier Batman comics of the 50s and 60s, are generally not marketed under the sign of any particular author. It's not called William Dozier's Batman TV show. Neither have the later movies of the 1990s, Batman Forever and Batman and Robin, ever been marketed with the name of the director, Joel Schumacher, prominently on the posters or packaging. This lack of an author within the schema that Foucault attributes to Saint Jerome aligns then with the logic that would regard these works of Batman as inferior. And this contrasts distinctly with the actually very small number of Batman comics with which Frank Miller is associated. Notice how his name gets significant billing on the front cover of the current edition of the text that we are reading, or the way it is used on a hardcover collectible such as this. The same is true for the advertising campaigns that accompanied Tim Burton's 1989 Batman movie, the movie that is seen by many as finally dislodging the cultural memory of the 1966 TV show as the dominant vision of the character in the public mind. The original posters gave top billing to the stars of Michael Keaton and Jack Nicholson. Strikingly, you might note that Nicholson, who played the Joker, is given top billing, which says something about his status as one of the biggest movie stars in the world at the time. But note how prominent Burton's name is on the posters created for other markets, or on reissue posters, and even on fan art speculating about a third Batman movie that he actually never made. This is in keeping with Burton's status as an auteur, which is just the French word for author and is often used in English to refer to filmmakers whose names denote a style or canon of movies, such as Hitchcock or Wes Anderson or Todd Haynes and so on. Something similar happens in the case of the Christopher Nolan Batman movies, the success of which has now eclipsed the memory of even the Burton films. What we see in Nolan is a literally growing credit. The more successful his movies, the bigger his name gets. Now, I want to suggest this is not just a function of Nolan's growing reputation as a director over the time that he worked on the Batman franchise. It's also a sign of the author function working in the way Foucault suggests. The versions of Batman that DC wishes to authorize are granted that authority through the name of an author, or in the case of movies, an auteur, while texts that do not acquire such a name, while not exactly eliminated from the Bat canon, are comparatively diminished in significance. Now, criteria 2, 3, and 4, with their references to coherence, stylistic uniformity, and historic events, might seem to have little bearing on a long-running transmedia series such as Batman. But if we consider them in relation to Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns, we can perhaps start to understand why Miller's name in particular has emerged as one of the very small number of proper names to have something like a full-blown author function in relation to the multi-authored property of Batman. Consider what Batman was like in the early 80s before Miller worked on the character. It was already a decades-old comic book serial, the product of literally hundreds of creators. One curious convention of such long-running serial fictions is the paradox of a kind of impossible continuity. Events occur in separate storylines that contribute to the larger narrative. Think, for example, of the coming and going of different Robins. Bruce Wayne takes in Dick Grayson as his ward and trains him to fight crime. Dick grows up and leaves, eventually taking on a new identity as a character called Nightwing. Yeah, Really nice job differentiating yourself there, Dick. And then Bruce takes on another young ward to serve as Robin, with Dick's blessing, as we see in this sequence. So these are emotional beats in the life of the characters that are imagined to have occupied a span of years. But when exactly are such events supposed to have occurred when we step back and consider the character's history as a whole? Logically, this becomes extremely difficult to determine, in part because Batman himself never really seems to age. As the critic Jeff Klock has written, the reader is given to understand that the Batman fighting crime in 1939, the cheery, goofy 1960s Batman reciting the proverbial "good job, old chum," and the solitary, grim, nearly psychotic, nocturnal 1980s Batman who watches Ronald Reagan on television are one and the same continuous character. This effect is normally achieved by establishing continuity on an episode-to-episode basis, with only a very small number of events, such as the origin, having implications for the master narrative. A new episode may relate to that which came immediately before, but its relationship to the larger whole is vague and hazy. Each new story is simply added to the next, without calling attention to aspects of prior stories that, with the passage of time, may have started to strain credulity. Stories in which Batman encounters a mischievous and magical imp-like version of himself from another dimension, for example, or stories that foreground the impossible telescoping of time suggested by the longer continuity. As Klock points out, I think correctly, Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns is a radical move in the history of the Batman character because it tries to compose a story that makes sense of its history rather than mechanically adding another story to the Batman folklore. It must participate in the larger tradition in order to be recognized as a Batman story, but it consciously organizes that tradition in such a way as to comment on 45 years of Batman comic books. This reworking organizes the Batman canon's contradictory parts into a coherent whole. To put it in the terms of Foucault's essay, in The Dark Knight Returns, Frank Miller serves as his own Saint Jerome by producing a narrative that is also an attempt to impose a discipline and coherence upon the contents of an increasingly disparate and unruly prior canon. He does this in part by insisting that the generic conventions that The Dark Knight Returns adopts, many of which actually derive from films and novels that participate in what we might call the hard-boiled school of crime fiction, were always the real conventions of Batman. As a matter of fact, few prior Batman stories adopt the first-person voiceover narrator that Miller frequently employs throughout, and which is very much associated with hard-boiled crime fiction. And I would venture to say that no prior Batman comic is as unflinchingly and even sadomasochistically invested in the depiction of physical violence. But Miller's artistic strategy is to make us believe that he's not so much reinventing Batman as he is conforming to previously established doctrine. He does this in part by what we might think of as a creative variation on the fourth of Foucault's constants in the construction of an authorial canon, by taking a different perspective on time and history from almost all prior Batman stories. First of all, he ages Batman in what would be something like real time, given the era in which he was working. Instead of the eternally youthful Batman of the regular serialized comics, in other words, Miller's Batman is almost the age that we might expect him to be in the 1980s if he had started out in his 20s sometime in the 1940s. Second, Miller places this historically aged Batman in a Gotham that shares recognizable features of 1980s New York architecture, such as Twin Towers, and he further anchors the text in the contemporary present of its composition by making then-President Ronald Reagan a supporting character. In other words, Miller produces a text that conforms to the kinds of principles associated with the construction of an authorial canon as Foucault describes them. And in so doing, Miller lends his text the kind of authority associated with the author function. In the process, his name becomes one of the very few proper names to take on an author function in relation to the Batman property. As Klock further notes, Miller also finds ways to synthesize Batman's confused and contradictory history on a smaller scale. Batman appears throughout The Dark Knight Returns in a number of different costumes with various bat shield chest emblems reflecting 45 years of costume design. In one amusing example, readers are finally given an explanation for one of the more confusing aspects of the garb, the eye-catching yellow bat shield on a uniform meant to blend in with the shadows. When Batman takes a rifle shot to the chest, which any reader assumes would kill him instantly, it reveals metal shielding. Batman says, "Why do you think I wear a target on my chest? Can't armor my head." And with that one line, a 30-year mystery dissolves, as every reader runs mentally through previous stories, understanding that plate as always having been there. Or so says Jeff Clark, anyway. So, rather than being just one of the many thousands of men and women who have worked on the Batman property, Miller becomes an author of Batman in the Foucauldian sense. And understanding Foucault's concept of the author function can help us to understand Miller's success at appropriating some of the power and authority associated with those functions to himself. The extent of Miller's success is suggested by the degree to which his name functions in another way that Foucault discusses in the final section of his essay. There, Foucault suggests that authors are initiators of discursive practices. The distinctive contribution of these authors is that they produce not only their own work, but the possibility and the rules of formation of other texts. In this sense, their role differs entirely from that of a novelist, for example, who is basically never more than the author of his own text. Freud is not simply the author of the Interpretation of Dreams, and Marx is not simply the author of the Communist Manifesto. They both established the endless possibility of discourse. Now you will notice that Foucault is at pains here to distinguish the discursive practices initiated by Marx and Freud, Marxism and psychoanalysis respectively, from those initiated by novelists. He name-checks Anne Radcliffe, who is an important figure in the history of Gothic fiction. Foucault seems to think that Marx and Freud not only made possible a certain number of analogies that could be adopted by future texts, but, as importantly, they also made possible a certain number of differences. They cleared a space for the introduction of elements other than their own, which nevertheless remain within the field of discourse that they initiated. But while this is true of Marx or Freud, the same cannot be said for genre writers such as Radcliffe, at least according to Foucault. Now I have to say, I find this a rather conservative claim, at least with respect to genre fictions, discourses such as horror fiction, crime fiction, science fiction, westerns, romances, and indeed superhero stories. Who is Foucault to say that these popular genres are really that different from the intellectual genres of Marxist critique or psychoanalytic criticism in terms of their capacity to advance, grow, and change, even as they remain recognizably within their respective genre fields? It also seems to me that library shelves are groaning under the weight of works of Marxist and psychoanalytic theory that add very little to the larger discourses in which they participate, but merely put into circulation a certain number of resemblances and analogies patterned on the prior works of Marx and Freud, to use Foucault's own phrasing. Which is, of course, precisely Foucault's reason for denying a genre writer such as Anne Radcliffe the initiatory status that he wants to give to Marx or Freud. So, while I'm therefore inclined to agree with Foucault that one thing that may distinguish authors in his particular understanding of the term from mere writers is that authors initiate discursive practices, I am nevertheless entirely unpersuaded by his effort to distinguish the intellectual genres of Marxism and psychoanalysis from genre fictions on this basis. On the contrary, I would argue that authors such as Radcliffe, or Edgar Allan Poe, or Arthur Conan Doyle are precisely initiators of discursive practices in the sense that Foucault describes within their respective discursive or generic fields. And with respect to the superhero, Frank Miller may well stand in similar relation to that generic field. The Dark Knight Returns managed to rewrite Batman history, so that even to this day it is possible to find people arguing that this book recovered a true essence of Batman that had been corrupted. when in fact it was a radical reinvention of the character that took pulp elements that had always been present in the concept to entirely new levels, aspects of the crime and western genres in particular. But besides changing how we thought of Batman's past, Miller's work also had a tremendous impact on the next generation of Batman stories, culminating in the almost unremittingly tragic and bleak version of the character that we discovered in Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, a version of Batman that would simply be inconceivable, I would suggest, if Frank Miller had never been published. Once again, there is much more that could be said, both about Foucault's challenging essay and Miller's challenging work, and the mixture of radical and conservative impulses that I actually see in both texts. But we can discuss the relative radicalism or conservatism of Frank Miller's text in our discussion next time. So I will conclude with what I see as one basic take-home point that emerges very clearly from reading Foucault alongside Batman. Literally hundreds of people have worked on different Batman stories across all kinds of media platforms over the past 80 years. But across that vast and profuse canon, far too much material for even the most fanatical Batman enthusiast to read or watch or indeed to play with it all. Only a tiny percentage of those creators have been granted anything approaching authorial status. The whys and wherefores and implications of that fact could inspire several more discussions, but we cannot even begin those discussions until we have fully absorbed this basic truth. All texts have authors in the sense that someone or several someones made the marks, wrote the words, drew the pictures. But very few of those someones get to partake of the power and authority associated with the Foucauldian author function.